All right, the third system that we're talking about in Chapter 11 is the respiratory system. Again, just to remind you of our levels of biological organization, we're still in the systems organs level. And we're talking about organ systems that are aiding and maintaining homeostasis. So we talked about the accessory organs of the digestive system working to maintain blood glucose levels. We talked about the kidneys maintaining multiple things. So the kidneys reabsorb water or excrete water to maintain blood volume. The kidneys excrete hydrogen ions to maintain blood pH. The kidneys excrete urea to get rid of metabolic waste to make sure that those levels stay within normal ranges. And the kidneys also reabsorb glucose to maintain the blood glucose levels. So now we're going to move on and talk about the respiratory system. The respiratory system is important for maintaining blood pH, which is not something we always think about with the respiratory system. So we're going to talk through how that works. And obviously the respiratory system is also supplying the body with oxygen, which it needs for the cells to be able to make energy. So looking at the respiratory system anatomy, the respiratory system is divided into the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So when air enters, it enters through either the nasal cavity or the mouth, and those cavities help to warm and moisten air as it enters. It passes then through the pharynx, which is that shared passageway between the digestive system and the respiratory system. And then it's going to pass through the opening to the larynx, through the larynx or the voice box, and then it enters the lower respiratory system. So it passes down into the trachea, and the trachea splits off into the primary bronchi, which are these main two branches, and those then undergo further and further branching as they enter into the lungs. So they branch into bronchioles, which then end up at what are called alveoli or air sacs in the lungs. And air sacs in the lungs, or the alveoli, are where the gas exchange is going to occur in the lungs. So where the carbon dioxide from the blood will enter the lungs and where the oxygen from the lungs will enter the bloodstream. The diaphragm is also very important in the respiratory system, so that would be considered an accessory organ. It's not actually part of the respiratory system, but without the diaphragm muscle, we wouldn't be able to breathe in and out. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is just a video showing a bronchoscopy, and I want to show you this just to show this branching pattern that occurs in the bronchioles. So every branch you go down, you can choose a path to go down, and you can see multiple branches off of that. So the further you go into the lungs, you're actually going to branch more and more and more, and those branches will get smaller and smaller and smaller until they end up in microscopic alveoli. So looking at the lung structure, there's in your book under 11.2 on page 108 using the top numbers, you can see that observation lung structure. So we're not going to do that in class, obviously. So I have here a microscope image of lung tissue, and you can see that a lot of it is open tissue, and that's those alveoli, that's those air sacs. So those air sacs have very thin layers of cells surrounding them, which works similarly to how the layers of cells surrounding the capillaries work. It allows for a lot of exchange to happen. Some places you can see the blood supply to the lungs. So here's a place where you can see a branch of the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery is going to bring blood to the lungs, and then pulmonary capillaries are going to be associated with each air sac. And then the blood leaves the lungs through the pulmonary vein. So the main functions of the respiratory system are breathing, so inhalation and exhalation, and that breathing enables what's called external respiration and internal respiration. And the main idea of both external and internal respiration is gas exchange. So external respiration is the gas exchange that happens in the lungs. So that's where carbon dioxide would leave the blood and go into the lungs. Oxygen would leave the lungs and go into the blood. And then internal respiration is the gas exchange that happens in the body at body tissues. So at body tissues, oxygen would leave the blood and go into the body tissue. Carbon dioxide that's built up in all the cells of our bodies would leave the body tissues and go into the blood. So this is looking more closely at chemically what's happening when this gas exchange occurs. So when we're in the lungs, the carbon dioxide from our bodies leaves the lungs, and oxygen is going to get picked up and enter the blood. So let's talk about oxygen first because it's less complicated. So hemoglobin is in all of our red blood cells. We've talked about how red blood cells have almost nothing but hemoglobin in them, and hemoglobin can bind to oxygen. So oxygen in the lungs is going to diffuse into the associated capillaries, into the bloodstream, bind to hemoglobin, and produce oxyhemoglobin, and that's how it'll be transported in the body. Carbon dioxide is actually transported in the body mainly as bicarbonate ions, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute and see how that happens. But when you get to the lungs, these bicarbonate ions combine with hydrogen ions to form something called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then, with the help of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, dissociates into water and carbon dioxide. So this carbon dioxide is what we then breathe out at our lungs. So it'll go from the bicarbonate ions that are in our bloodstream to carbon dioxide in the lungs, which will then be exhaled. Then when you get to body tissues, the opposite reactions occur. So the oxyhemoglobin that was formed in the lungs is going to dissociate back into hemoglobin and oxygen, and this oxygen will diffuse into body tissues that need it. Carbon dioxide, which has been produced in all the body tissues, is going to combine with water, and with the help of this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, produces carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So this is where those bicarbonate ions are produced. That's the main way that carbon dioxide is transported in our bloodstream. It's important to note, too, that along with bicarbonate ions come hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions, as we've said, are directly related to pH. So whenever you have more carbon dioxide, you're going to have more hydrogen ions, and therefore the pH will decrease. So this is how the lungs play a role in maintaining homeostasis of blood pH, is that every time you breathe out carbon dioxide, you're getting rid of excess hydrogen ions, and that's going to help bring a low pH back up into normal range. So this is a busy figure, but this is just showing graphically what we just talked about on the last few slides. So when we're in the lungs, oxygen is going to diffuse from the lungs to the red blood cells, bind to hemoglobin, and create oxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide, bicarbonate ions that are transported in the blood plasma are going to go combine with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid. That'll dissociate into water and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then will diffuse into the lung and can be breathed out. Carbon dioxide also can bind to hemoglobin, so hemoglobin also will release its carbon dioxide at the lungs and allow it to be breathed out. At the body tissues, the opposite reactions occur. So oxygen that's being carried by hemoglobin is going to dissociate and diffuse into the tissues. Carbon dioxide that's being produced in the tissues is going to diffuse into the blood. It's going to combine with water to make carbonic acid, which then will dissociate into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Again, the bicarbonate ions gets transported in the plasma, and then that goes up and does the opposite reaction in the lungs. Control of breathing is mainly dependent on the pH of our cerebrospinal fluid. And the pH is directly related to how much carbon dioxide is in our bloodstream. So right here it says receptor cells near the respiratory center in the brain respond to changes in cerebrospinal fluid hydrogen ions caused by increases in our arterial carbon dioxide. So as carbon dioxide levels in our blood increase, hydrogen ion concentrations will also increase, and that's also true in our cerebrospinal fluid. So that hydrogen ion increase is going to cause a low pH. Our blood is becoming more and more acidic, and our body responds to that by having us breathe more, so we get rid of more carbon dioxide to bring the pH back up within normal levels. So if you're holding your breath for as long as you can, I know some of you have tried to hold your breath for as long as you can, and eventually you get to a point where you just have to breathe and you can't voluntarily overcome that desire to breathe. You know, we think of that as being because we need oxygen, and we've been holding our breath so long that our bodies just need oxygen. But the truth is that what triggers that desire to breathe that we can't overcome is that we need to get rid of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is building up in our blood and we have to breathe it out. And so our brains are triggering our respiratory system to breathe. So we get rid of carbon dioxide and get rid of those excess hydrogen ions. So the blood pH is going to decrease as the carbon dioxide increases. So we just looked at that here. Carbon dioxide is going to combine with water to form carbonic acid, dissociating into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So whenever we have more carbon dioxide, we're going to have more hydrogen ions and a lower pH. So you can go ahead and pause your video and complete questions 1 and 2 and the summary under lung function. That's on pages 109 and 110 in your lab manual using those top numbers. So go ahead, pause your video and complete those. So now we're going to talk about respiration, or the process of breathing. So we breathe 14 to 20 cycles a minute, which means we breathe about 20,000 times every day. And when we breathe, we take in oxygen and we excrete or give off carbon dioxide. A key concept here to note is that air is always going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So when we breathe, what we're actually doing is changing the pressure in our lungs to be either lower than or higher than atmospheric pressure outside of our body. So you can see here, when we inhale, the amount of nitrogen in the inhaled and exhaled air doesn't change dramatically. We inhale more oxygen than we exhale, so some of that oxygen got picked up by our red blood cells. And we inhale very low levels of carbon dioxide, and we exhale much more carbon dioxide. So how do we change the pressure inside of our lungs? Well, we do that by changing the volume, because volume and pressure are inversely related. So if we increase the volume of our lungs and our thoracic cavity, we decrease the pressure. And because air is always going to flow from high pressure to low pressure, if we decrease the pressure to the point that it's lower than atmospheric pressure, air is going to naturally flow from outside of our bodies into our lungs. When we breathe out, the opposite happens. We decrease the volume of our lungs and thoracic cavity. That's going to increase the pressure, and once that pressure gets greater than atmospheric pressure, it's going to cause that air to flow from inside of our lungs to outside of our bodies. Inspiration, or breathing in, is the active phase of respiration, meaning it requires contraction of muscles. And the main muscle that is used for inspiration is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm, again, is this flat muscle that sits right underneath our lungs. And as we contract our diaphragms, they lower and flatten. At the same time, muscles called external intercostal muscles are going to pull our rib cages up and out. And the combination of our diaphragms moving down and our rib cages moving out is going to significantly increase the volume of our lungs and our thoracic cavity. So when we increase the volume, we decrease the pressure, and that causes air to flow in to our lungs. Expiration then is passive. So once we're done breathing in, if we just relax and let those muscles relax and go back to their original places, the diaphragm is going to move back up, the rib cage will move down and in, the volume of our lungs and thoracic cavity will decrease, and therefore the pressure will increase. So the pressure increases to the point that it is greater than the atmospheric pressure outside of our bodies, and air naturally flows from the greater pressure in our lungs to the lower pressure out of our lungs. So somebody in the very beginning of the semester asked about hiccups, and I wanted to make a note about hiccups here. So hiccups involve our diaphragms and spasms of the diaphragms. So normally when we're breathing, our epiglottis is out of the way. You remember looking at the epiglottis in the fetal pig and how it blocks the airway when we swallow to make sure that food and stuff that we take in doesn't get in our airways. So normally when we're breathing in and out, the epiglottis is open and our airway is nice and open. When we have hiccups, our diaphragm spasms, and so it contracts very suddenly. And so when our diaphragm contracts suddenly, it very suddenly increases the volume of our thoracic cavity, it decreases the pressure, and that rapid decrease in pressure actually causes our epiglottis to snap shut. So our epiglottis snapping shut, it was what causes that hiccup sound when we have hiccups. So every time the diaphragm spasms, it contracts and flattens and causes a quick decrease in, or a decrease in pressure, and causes that epiglottis to snap shut. So we can measure respiratory volumes, or the volumes of our lungs, using something called a spirometer. So on page 111 using the top numbers, or 141 using the bottom numbers, there's an experimental procedure. We're not going to do this one. Obviously we're not going to do it in class, but I'm not going to actually do this one for you either. We're just going to talk through what these different respiratory volumes are. So you don't need to fill out the rest of that experimental procedure on page 112, or the conclusions associated with it on page 112. But you do need to know what these different respiratory volumes are. So let's talk through what they are. So tidal volume is what we call the normal amount of air that moves into and out of your lungs when you are doing restful breathing. So as you're sitting there listening to this video and you're just breathing in and out, that is a tidal volume. It's the normal amount of air that moves in and out of your lungs. Your inspiratory reserve volume is how much more air you can breathe in than you normally do when you're doing restful breathing. So you can feel your inspiratory reserve volume as you're sitting there. So when you're breathing in, just stop after you inspire some air and breathe in as much more air as you possibly can. So you can feel that it's a huge amount of air. So typically our tidal volume is about half a liter, and it's about 3 liters more of air. That's our inspiratory reserve volume. So additional air that we can breathe in if we need to. Our expiratory reserve volume is kind of the opposite. It's the additional amount of air you can breathe out beyond what your tidal volume is. So if you're doing restful breathing and you stop after you exhale, and then you blow out as much air as you possibly can force out of your lungs, that's your expiratory reserve volume. So it's not quite as great as your inspiratory reserve volume, but it's usually about double your tidal volume. Vital capacity is what we call the total amount of air that you can take into and breathe out of your lungs. So it is your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve volume plus your expiratory reserve volume. So you can feel your vital capacity if you breathe in as much air as you possibly can, and then you blow out as much air as you possibly can. That air that you're blowing out is your vital capacity, and usually it's between 5 and 6 liters of air that you can move into and out of your lungs. So at this point in your lab manual, you should be able to fill out the answers to the conclusion section for chapter 11. So that's pages 116 and 117 using your top numbers. So the conclusion, homeostasis, has questions 1 through 3 there, which involves table 11.6. So make sure you get those all filled out. And you also need to do the lab review for chapter 11. So that's posted as a Moodle assignment, so you can fill it out on Moodle when you're done with all these sections.